Christian mystic whose writings Dr. King read extensively, and Howard Thurman made the case that in fact you can never fix the problem when you stay in separate corners. He made the case that in fact there had to be proximity and fellowship if things would get worked out. If minds are going to be changed, then people have to come together. Segregation is an essential wrong because it does not allow a reorientation when people simply withdraw to maintain power over their own lives and leave the other group to themselves. Real change never happens. And he was impressed by that. That's why in most of his speeches you'll hear him talk about the day when everybody could freely be together. He didn't just talk about an empowered race. He talked about humanity joining hands together. And he got that from Howard Thurman. He also was greatly impressed by Gandhi. How sometimes wrong can most clearly be seen when it is in juxtaposition right next to what is right. And that's why the idea of passive protest actually worked so well, because while those who were mean-spirited got even meaner, the ones who were being mistreated took it, and when they took it, mean looked mean, similar to Jesus on the cross. He got that from Gandhi. He even was informed by Malcolm X. Some say Malcolm X was his antagonist. He was the one who caused him all of the problem. They weren't enemies. He learned much from him. And one of the things he got from Malcolm X is that at least something has to be done. The worst ones are those who sit by and do nothing. And while Malcolm X believed that what had to happen because society was so corrupted is that there needed to be an apocalyptic destruction of what existed, and King didn't believe that. He believed that it could be modified, tweaked, and fixed to be all that it should be. Still, he got from Malcolm X that you got to be willing to die for something if you're really going to live. And then finally, and most importantly, he was impacted by Jesus the Christ. We all know that he wasn't just a person who decided one day to get involved, but it was his faith that made him get involved. Dr. King went to school and he studied hard. He was a theologian, a deep theologian. He had received theological training first from his father and what he heard and experienced in the church. But then he went on to get a PhD, getting deeper into the things of God. And in most of his speeches, you'll find the teachings of Jesus riddled all through his declarations. He rarely came up with that which was unique. He just uniquely stated what already had been stated. Dr. King was a walking Bible, and Jesus was his ultimate example. I'd like to go to where Jesus, the ultimate activist, and I said it, Jesus, the ultimate activist, who didn't just sit back and let stuff happen to him, but who moved out in society and made things happen where he went. He changed the temperature when he walked in. He changed the atmosphere of the room. He changed the way people thought. He was an activist. Jesus, the ultimate activist, can be seen in the last scenes of his life. First of all, the penultimate act of activism was when they all gathered in a place like this, in an upper room, all of the important people in his life. And they sat around the table and they were eating just like we're eating today. They weren't paying attention to anything but their own desires and their own wants and their own needs, and each of them wanted to be stroked for what they had done. There's Judas on his left side, there's John on his right side. The disciples are whispering about who's going to be the greatest, and Jesus pushes away from the table and he walks over to another table that has just a basin and a pitcher of water, and he takes a towel and puts it around his arm, and he looks around the room, not at the faces of the important people, but at the dirty feet that were there at the tables. Dirty feet because they had been walking the streets of Palestine, and they had on open-toed sandals, and the dusty roads were covering up the excrement that had dropped from the wildlife that walked those streets, and the carts, and those carts, and they had rolled over it, and so you couldn't see it, and they're walking in there with clean robes but dirty feet. Wish I could preach right now about what has dirtied the feet of folks. Sometimes have on clean clothes and know all the right talk, but their feet are dirty. Jesus looks around and he sees the dirty feet. He had already smelled the scent of it in the room. Jesus is the one who should have been served. He was the greatest in that room, but he was demonstrating ultimate activism when he looked around and saw a need that had gone unmet. Somebody else should have done it, but because they didn't and it still needed to be done, Jesus began to stoop low and he took the water and began to wash dirty feet. That's activism. Finding a need and meeting the need with what you've got instead of talking about, look at all those dirty feet. And then the ultimate act of activism is when a lost humanity who didn't know they were lost, didn't desire to be saved, had to have the blood of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. I'm going to church now. And without the blood, humanity would have been eternally doomed, and they didn't request it. Sometimes you got to help when folks haven't requested it. He simply took up that cross and he walked up Calvary's hill. He allowed himself to be nailed to that cross, and when it was lifted high and dropped in the ground and his flesh began to tear, our Lord was not concentrating on his own pain, but he was looking around at the pain that was around that cross, and he saw a crying mother, and he said to John, take care of my mom. And a hurting Jesus with blood still flowing continued to look around, and he saw lost people who had no clue, and he said to his Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Then one of those thieves who had earlier been teasing our master cried out in desperation, remember me when you come to your kingdom. Jesus stopped his pain and his dying long enough to say, verily, I say to you today, you will be with me in paradise. This is the same Jesus who had picked up the severed ear of a Malchus and put it back on. Why? Because a severed ear needs to be reconnected. But that's an enemy, Lord. Sometimes the greatest acts of activism that change the environment are those acts that are akin to what the Bible declares. When our enemy needs some water, we give it to him. And the mind begins to be changed. Activism. Ladies and gentlemen, if we don't get involved in activism one more time, then the work of Dr. King and those who went before will go for nothing. Things are not yet okay. Everything is not yet all right. And even though your house might be well ordered, there are still those who are in pain, in darkness, and they're struggling, and their humanity is being challenged. And unless there are some people who, like a Jesus and like a Dr. King, are willing to die to lift humanity, then behind the closed doors of those multi-level houses, we're not really living. You've got to get involved one more time. We've got to keep it up. I conclude by telling you the story of that aqueduct built over in Spain back in 109 AD. It brought cooling waters down from the mountains into the city of Segovia and gave thirsty inhabitants what they needed to survive. Did it for some 19 centuries, that aqueduct. Some people said it's done its work now. Began to build a new watering system. This awesome aqueduct needs to be set up as a museum, they said. We need to tell our children about this marvel of engineering and all the work that it's done over the centuries. But we need to now let it rest. For centuries it had done its job, and it was beautiful as the water would come sparkling down from the mountains, but as soon as they shut it down and turned it into a museum piece, the sun began to bake the mortar and the bricks began to fall apart, and it was disintegrated in a matter of just weeks. What had survived during centuries of service disintegrated in just weeks of inactivity. And what has been built up over decades of blood and guts can be lost in a matter of just days of inactivity. None of the gains are permanent. They're all just temporary if we withdraw from the battlefield of service. But like Dr. King, who didn't send other folks out to march, but he marched. Who didn't just talk about justice, but he fought for it. Who took blows to the face and got stabbed in his chest. And ultimately, after going to jail, being spied on and talked about, he died. Because he knew that if he had nothing to live for or die for, he never should have been born. And I'll say to those of you, I talk now to the young people who sometimes view life as though you're outside of it. I'm telling you now that the gifts that you will receive today and the confidence that others are placing in you, not just talking about how great you can be, but doing something about it. You got to pick up the baton and you got to run with it. You got to make a decision today that wherever you see need, you're going to do what you can to help alleviate that need. Don't just talk about it. Talk is cheap. Be about it. God bless you.